Welcome to the Critique of the Week, 1 week critiques interview series where we discuss the development of an individual piece of poetry or prose over time. I'm Ingrid Wenzler, an editor for 1 week critique, and this is Sarah Mina, the author of Bright Archive, a collection of visual essays forthcoming from Rescue Press this fall, and the author of Slim Confessions, forthcoming from Noemi Press in 2021. Sarah, you're also an assistant professor of English and creative writing at the Cleveland Institute of Art, curator of the visual essay series at Essay Daily, a video editor at Tri-Quarterly Review, and an assistant director of the Cleveland Drafts Literary Festival. You hold a PhD in creative nonfiction from Ohio University and an MFA in creative nonfiction from the University of Arizona. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Today we'll be looking at aspects and portions of Foul Chutes on the archive downriver. Let's first give our audience a bit of context for your work and that particular piece. Bright Archive, one of your forthcoming books, is a collection of visual essays. For those who aren't familiar with the term, what exactly is a visual essay, Sarah?
A good question. I think I started using that term to distinguish from other examples of prose that used visual material like a graphic narrative or a fluxus piece. And I thought visual essay was the right language for signaling that part of the work was visual in some way, because visual poetry is a genre that exists and it uses design, graphic design specifically on page spreads rather than paired illustrations the way that graphic narrative would. So it was sort of a combination of like the essay or video essay plus visual poetry ended me at visual essay. And it's also because I'm interested in the way that that genre of prose uses what can be seen that is extra textual as part of what we think of as essaying. So if an essay has a job or a verb, how is the visual material assisting in or furthering that action? And so that's how I think of a visual essay as defined.
Lovely. I'm actually going to show a couple examples of your visual presentations now. Of the many essays in your personal archives, why share Foul Cities on the archive downriver with us?
Well, I was thinking about this piece as one that had the most iterations of many of the essays that I've written. It's the first draft that I looked at is about 4 years old, which is actually not as many years old as initial drafts of a lot of other pieces I've worked on, but it surprised me to discover that. And when I was looking at the original draft, I noticed how different it was than the iterations that came. And this piece also has lived in quite a number of different forms along the way, and that process has really led to the final product becoming a lot different, both for the way it's adjusted for space and for the ear. So I think the two versions are fun to look at and to compare.
You sent me excerpts of 5 different versions of this particular essay. Can you read the first couple paragraphs of version 1 for us?
Sure. The chute, etc. Waste is put at the boundary, the marginal space for further removal or transaction. In praise of the linen chute, the all-accepting hatch, that which funnels what is soiled down and away. At first a loose tunnel, itself made of linen, a sleeve with one long seam. It threads the house and channels the foul small clothes, the olive shirts, to be revived. Then later a passage of sheet metal and waxed to make the slide. A highway for rats and absconders, for thieves and assassins the same. The chute, it makes invisible. It leads to indeterminate elsewhere. To shoot, verb, is also to discharge, fling, propel, to blame. 1891, a chute to the laundry. Ingenious local architect designing model tenement house. Occupants who have lived in blocks provided with similar postal conveniences will be cautioned against sending their correspondence to be washed. No data is available on the linen chute's origins or its modern numbers, likely because a chute lacks elements necessary to attribute claims of invention. A chute is more a place than a mechanism. The building of chutes was even outlawed for a time after, on several occasions, the passage that directed filth down and away from residents carried smoke and flames back up to them and facilitated their quick decay. In America, mention of the chute begins around 1890 in newspapers and domestic manuals. The initial presence of a laundry chute in a home meant the absence of soiled linens in common rooms and the scents and stains that accompany bodily processes. In America, the chute signified a current at the turn of the century along which built environments were adjusting to compartmentalize domestic working and leisure spaces, and thus removing any sign of everyday metabolics and decay from the polite spaces of the home. The chute's modern popularity has much to do with convenience and compartmentalization, as with a kind of vintage and nostalgia, the strange acknowledgement that a house is not solid through and through, and with the kind of small thrill akin to dropping gum out the window of a moving vehicle.
This version and other early versions concern themselves mainly with the laundry chute. What sparked your interest in the laundry chute as a marginal space in the first place? And how did this essay originate for you?
Well, as the essay sort of investigates more as the versions extend, is that I grew up in a lot of old houses, and they ended up being something I wrote about a lot later on, and I really couldn't figure out what it was about them that I was interested in. But a lot of the work I was making was about these sort of interstitial zones or weird places in a house that has been inhabited by many other people before you, and the remnants you find, and the weird layers of paint and wallpaper you can discover, and sort of how unfamiliar your most personal space can be when you sort of like enter and explore it. And the laundry chute is one of those places that I think it exists. It was functional. Many houses have them or have them sealed over, and I grew up with them around and with them feeling dangerous in some way, sort of like a passage where things were meant to fall through the home. And I sort of loved that mystery and the tension around it. And I started thinking about the way, there's a few examples of essays that take a turn through research. Like they think they're researching something, curious and historic, and then they discover like a sorted background for that subject. And so I was interested in what I might find if I just pursued more research on the fowl chute. And I think I did end up finding some sort of gross histories of who ends up in laundry shirts or what went down them or what they were for, how they're related to trash in many ways. So that became a path of interest through research.
Perfect. Fowl Chutes on the archive downriver is just one name for an essay that, in your own words, has lived several lives. In one of the emails we traded leading up to this conversation, you said, of the 5 excerpts you shared with me, that it's as if the essay isn't just revised, but reincarnated in some way by adjusting both its diction and its visual shape to serve each new format where it gets presented. Can you describe those different lives, say a little bit about how or where this particular essay has lived?
Sure. The essay began, I guess, as an idea of something I would like to write about. And then the first time I wrote about Chutes was for the Doppler Collective, which is a working group of artists in Atlanta. And I was asked to contribute a piece to a group show, and so I just wrote what I read to you, 2 pages with 3 columns and sort of a garble of history about the laundry chute and ways I was thinking about why it was so hard to research, how it's defined, what it means to invent a hole in a house. And so the first version of it was, it actually became what they called the keystone piece for the show. So all the other artists made work around those 2 pages, and I gave a reading at the opening. And the text was actually displayed in kind of an accordion shape that I designed alongside the curators. So that center column was still functional, but it sort of popped out in a different direction than the body of the text. So it had little chutes and passageways through what was otherwise an accordion fold. That was the first version. And then this tells you a lot about my writing process and why it's so slow, but I definitely got stuck after that. There were a lot of other people making work about the subject, and I was sort of full of thinking. And so I just decided that I would do something unusual for me and write an object lesson about the piece in a way that I was trying to get myself to articulate something explicit about the history. And I was like, well, maybe if I write it in this genre, in this format, outside of the lyric essay mode, I'll have to say that. I'll make myself articulate it in some way. So I did, and it was published through Object Lessons, the series through the Atlantic. And then, so that was like its second life. And then I sort of took it, I think once that happened, I sort of felt like I could subvert that entire mode. Like I did discover a few things about what I had thought in regards to questions of invention and history, and it made me do a little more research. And then I found after that the format of 2 columns with the river shape in the middle, because I realized that all the chutes that I was writing about fed from the top of the house to the bottom, and the trash from that house fed into the land, and the land fed into the river that all these houses were beside. And wow, rivers are sort of like chutes, and that they are not a solid shape, but they're negative space, but they're also the land, but they're also water. And so, I was interested in the resonances I was finding there. And that was, I think a lot of the revisions I do are really about finding the right form and playing with space and then getting text to fill it. So that kind of weave on the page felt like I'd arrived at something. And that was published in that form in a long PDF, like a scrolling PDF in a digital space, which was very difficult to reproduce in physical form, except for on another actually very long scroll that I displayed in a library on a cranky, which is a folk object that is used for displaying scrolled panoramas. And historically, it was just a combination of a candle, a frame, and a narrative. The light would come through the back. And so the cranky usually goes horizontal, so I had to build it so it could hang and scroll vertically. And then, funnily enough, I decided to hang that whole essay in a gallery much larger horizontally. So I had to fully redesign the text, the 2 channels, if you will, of the river to be parallel but running side to side. So that was laborious and intensive, and I did end up changing the text and squeezing it into some other shapes and making cuts where I needed to. And the form that it finally lives in is the horizontal form with the 2 parallel channels, but in a book you would read it. I have Ariana Reines' book here. In a book you would read it, you would have to turn it this way to read it because the 2 channels go like this, up and down. So it's maybe a combination of the last 2 forms. And the opening is a lot different as a result of having to morph in all those ways.
Well, wow, I have so many questions about the cranky and your labor around that, but I'm going to stay with revision. I really like the distinction you're drawing between revision and reincarnation, and think that's one that makes really good sense for this particular piece. Revision seeing again in academia, I think, sometimes carries the implication that seeing differently or seeing again is seeing better. There's a sense of progression, of moving forward and getting away from a draft that in some way wasn't quite right. Maybe the grammar's off, maybe you want to tinker with a sentence, that kind of thing. Reincarnation, a word less burdened by those connotations, I think is a better fit for what you're up to here. It seems to me that your attitude toward revising is about seeing new possibilities and maybe refusing a little to let this essay be static. Why can't it be 5 individual essays? Why does it have to be one? Am I right about that? And is that how you think about revision at least some of the time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And thank you for those thoughts. I think that's really generous. And I think as someone who comes from, in college, I studied visual art. That's mostly what I was making. I didn't do a traditional English degree. I took one creative writing class. And so I think I came to writing with a different sense of production and process.
Mm.
And when I'm remaking an essay for a new space, like let's say even after it's published, like that object's lesson was a publication, right? As we think of it, I had a stipend associated with it. It was shared. It still exists on the web. And then, right, I have another publication that comes later in the literary sense at Ninth Letter. So and it's a much different essay, but it's also the same as I and you were saying. And so I think that comes from my sense that in an artistic practice, someone could have a painting or a sculpture or even a performance that could be shown for a while in a gallery, and that's a form of publication. But it could then be shown in another gallery, in a group show, or in a show of that individual artist's work. And there's not this idea of work that is sort of finished and is over in the same way, at least in the sense that I'm thinking about it in terms of publication in the literary world. And so sometimes it's a relief and maybe some type of subversion I'm working with to think that the work I'm making is not attached to a sense of productivity or a sense of always moving forward and making more, and that this is over and now I need to make another one, and my work always being attached to kind of income. I think a lot of that is useful to push back against, especially if you're someone who's in the literary world and thinking about, what are you going to make next? What did you make last? What's your publication cycle? I think I'm kind of rejecting that and asking folks to think about how a publication isn't necessarily like the final version of something, and it can have, many lives. And yeah, I think it is 5 essays probably, but I also fully believe that the essay that exists in the book is made of all the others. It's also not distinct from them. It relies on me having to format the essay this way and then this way, and then think about how many sentences could fit in the opening and what a reader would read and be engaged in while standing up and walking along other people in a gallery, or what a reader would read and engage in if they were turning a crank at the same time. So I guess part of it is also forcing myself to see the work from a lot of other perspectives by refashioning it.
That makes perfect sense to me, and I relate to it. I was listening recently to this podcast, a philosophy podcast I'm fond of, and this philosopher Habermas is mentioned, and he describes thinking about history and the Enlightenment in particular, and always kind of reaching back into what's best about history and sort of moving forward by always reaching back and taking the best thing. Mm-hmm. I think it sounds like that also is a little of what you're up to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Because really each time I'm sort of taking the intestines of the piece forward, sloughing off a lot of the rest.
Yeah, I like that. So one question I have as someone who hasn't engaged the visual arts in the way you have, how does revising for a video essay or installation differ from or overlap even with revising on a page?
Yeah, I think that it means, the thing I think about most is that what it means is something hard for folks who are trained in writing, which is that the form or the circumstance or the exigence that you are translating or revising for will change the text as much as the text will change that form. So that means that the examples I was showing, like I was willing to cut a whole section of the essay in order to get it to fit in the horizontal scroll. And it means that the text isn't always privileged over the format or over the circumstances the audience will encounter it in. And I think that is actually really freeing sometimes when I'm working, because half the time when I'm really struggling with writing, I can say, oh, but I'm an artist. I'm not really a writer. It's okay that I'm struggling. And then when I'm like having a really hard time, I'm having to learn a wood saw. I'm having to think about math or spend a lot of time, hours and hours on top of a ladder. I'm like, I'm a writer. Why am I doing this? But it's nice to kind of have to go back and forth in that way. And I think it keeps me engaged in texts that I would otherwise sort of say, like, I'm going to move on from that, to be able to approach them from both both the audience member who's coming to look at the piece and the audience member who's coming to read the piece.
Sure. Has translating this essay from one form to another, from an installation to the page and back again, ever been a challenge for you? You're touching on that a little bit, but
yes,
getting text out.
Yes. Well, we could bring my partner in here and he could tell you about many hours. There was I rehung the scroll of the Chutes at a beautiful conference outside Seattle last year and I had some help setting it up. There's a lot of ladders involved. The ceiling was higher than I'd ever used before, and there's a lot of fishing line, and there was a lot of late night pizza. But I had told the folks helping me set up, I was like, oh, we can do it in 2 hours. I'll have 4 people plus me plus 2 ladders, and 5 hours in, I was like, oh, okay, it's not, this is a little more involved. And every time you go to a new space, the ceiling was so high, I had to throw the ball of fishing line over track lighting, and so then I had to reconfigure where all the hanging points would happen. And I think I have to think more like an artist in the future if I go to install in a new zone. And so it's definitely challenging. It means that I have to keep learning, and it means that one of the challenges is, I think that as a maker, as someone engaged in the literary world, I'm not reading as often as other writers are. I'm not as up on the text that I love and would like to have book clubs about all the time, because I'm also figuring out a new stitch, or figuring out which is the appropriate type of glue to use for certain temperatures. Or, it means that I'm sort of have a half knowledge of a lot of different materials and craft techniques. And so it just, and I think I feel a lot of self-acceptance around that at this point in my life, that I just make a sort of different version of work, and it means that the conversations I have and the way I approach making is just different. And I don't think I could do it any other way. So that has been a challenge, but it's been something I've sort of come to like about myself and the things I'm doing.
Yeah, it sounds like it's been a challenge that you've grown with, and that also, has allowed you, when you're feeling stuck in one form, to engage the other. So maybe there's, while you're not concerned with productivity, and more productivity in that way, and there's a way to stay inspired and keep making.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So going back to the text a little bit, when did you adopt the 2-column format in Fall Chutes, and what really worked for you about that format? It seems really crucial to the piece's evolution.
I think this is such a great question, because it makes me realize I had never recognized this about myself before, but a lot of my the text that I first write in a Word document, which is where I compose digitally for the first time, I often put the text into 2 columns right away, because I'm starting to try to see what it looks like if I blow out my expectations for the page, or what unexpected allegiances will befall my different scenes and facts once they, it surprises me how things will align or what space does to my sense of pacing right away. So one secret about Sarah Miner's work is if you see it in 2 columns, it's probably an early draft. And so that's true for the shoot. And I was just working on something the other day that I put into columns. So I was like, oh, I used to do this all the time. It just means that I'm starting again, essentially, for me. And so that, it's really easy to format that in a Word document. It does it for you. You don't have to do a bunch of crazy spacing, which I find myself doing a lot. So I think what worked with me about that format is I was thinking about negative space. And I think I'm always thinking about margins, thinking a lot about margins and gutters and white space. What I tell my students is that on the page, space is time for the reader, because if time passes at a certain pace in text and sentences, the reader will anticipate that time is also passing at that rate in a vacant space, and so it's giving the reader a moment of time. And of course, it's silence too. If you've had text is sound, no text is silence. So I was thinking about that, and then I, was able to format that falling section of facts into the shoot in the middle of the page. And yeah, I think that probably led me to think about a river as negative and positive space, and a channel as much as empty, right? Empty, it's water. I think probably the 2 columns actually led me to make some of the more personal associations that happen later in the piece, in the lives of the piece.
Yeah, which actually is a perfect transition for me, because I'm curious, in the final version of Chutes, the one that appears in the forthcoming book, Bright Archive, it seems to me that you pay as much attention to friendship, to underwear, to rivers and watersheds as you do to laundry chutes, which is where you started. Why that shift?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's about the type of research I was doing and my sense of trying to fathom the Mississippi riverbed. It was like really hard for me to conceive of, because like I kept learning about it, and I kept realizing things like, I have never lived outside of this landscape and I never knew the word before. Or like just the idea that like a river is not a river. It's just like one little branch of this whole, like the whole landscape is draining. Like everything you touch, everything you put in the ground is draining towards another point. And I was just like, I can't even fathom it, And so I had to sort of think bigger and bigger towards like my own implications in space and my relationships. And I was also at the time, I think there's been so many writers thinking about this lately, and we'll see some books coming out that address it, but just thinking about how a romantic relationship has always appeared as kind of a, like a tension point in pieces that I've written or read, even if it's sort of in the background, like, oh, there's a love here. That's like, it adds depth to any occasion that's being written about. And so what if instead in this piece I featured like the great loves of this story as my friends, like, my relationships with friends, because they have really shaped my adult life in, more than even my romances have. So I wanted to kind of use this to feature that. And I was thinking a lot about underwear and how, my friends are the people I would go to first to ask about that experience of finding lost underwear somewhere. So I did ask them, and then I just included their answers. That was the first time I'd really done that, just been like, this is a collaborative moment between me and many friends. So I think that's kind of, it kind of found its way as I was trying. I was like, how do I fathom this process that's also a place, that's also a continent, that's also like about my identity as someone who grew up on a river? And I sort of like reached out further and further, and then those parts kind of came back.
Lovely. And could you read the first couple of paragraphs of that final draft now for us?
Foul Chutes on the archive downriver. The house was exactly 100 years older than my sister. It stood facing the river across from another White House where, in 1932, the La Rosa family installed the first laundry chute in Rockford, Illinois, long before our city was named the country's third most miserable. By the mid-90s, a highway ran between my family's ailing Victorian and its Mississippi tributary, and for 10 years we lived up there, where Brown's Road ended, where the street might have tipped over the hill and rushed across the stinking river if someone hadn't changed his mind. We wore kitchen scissor bangs and liked to hang out at the dead end beside our porch, a bald gully stained with mulberries where we played at being orphaned, though we were far from it, past the broken curb where lost cars drew circles in the gravel. We preferred the dead end to our yard because it collected the street trash, and there we could sort out the best of it. In June of 1998, while he was renovating his home in St. Louis, Joseph Heathcott discovered a collection of trash in the cavity between his pantry and his laundry chute. It was a stack of paper scraps with sooty edges that were just beginning to stick and combine. There was a box of playing cards, a train ticket from Kansas, a receipt, a diary entry, and a laundry ticket. In Reading the Accidental Archive, Heathcott wrote that from these materials, he could read the tensions between the upward motivations and the limits to mobility of the early middle-class families just 4 miles from the Mississippi. As still happens in much of the world, the first method of washing clothes in colonial America was at the riverbank.
Finally, Sarah, where can we find your work? Where can we order this forthcoming book, Bright Archive?
You can order it from Rescue Press, from their website, and from a lot of local indie publishers, as well as where I would encourage you folks ordering. It's up for pre-order now, and it will be out October 20th of this year.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Sarah, for joining us for these beautiful readings and for all these remarkable insights into fall shoots, the visual, and your artistic practice. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you. For those interested in One Week Critique, you can find more on our projects at oneweekcritique.com. That's the number 1, followed by week and critique, as they're usually spelled. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sarah, for your generosity with all these great thoughts. Have a great night.
Thanks. Pleasure to be with you.